All right, so now we're heading down the road to the revolution. We're going to look at how these early colonies begin to develop, and their development really helps push them towards the revolution. So first, let's take a look and talk about New England. Okay, New England, we're going to focus on commerce and religion. So most New England colonists were small farmers. The land was very hilly and forested with rocky soil, making it not great for growing crops. They also had really long winters, so that meant a short growing season, which is also not ideal for farming. So they relied on large families to clear those fields, plant, and harvest them. Because as we see, there's not going to be very many enslaved individuals in New England. We call this type of farming, where it's mostly just to produce for yourself, subsistence farming. It's the practice of producing enough food for a farmer and his family, but not enough to sell for profit. And the reason that subsistence farming is primarily what is done in New England is because of the size of plots for land as well as the quality of the farmland. And the bad thing was that a poor year of farming could really ruin a family. They could starve, they could have to sell their land. Puritan leaders decided on the location and amount of land a family received. And this wasn't done equally or fairly. And so it ends up creating these distinct social classes. So the more you gave to the church or the more involved you were with the church, the more land you received, therefore the more wealthy you were. And of course, this causes tensions. So what did these people then do for a living if they weren't able to farm to make money? Well, they relied on fishing, whaling, and trade. So the Atlantic Ocean provided great economic opportunities for those who lived in New England. Fishers could participate in international trade, and they'd sell fish to London merchants in exchange for goods like shoes, textiles, metal products, things that they couldn't make here in the United States or the colonies at the time. Whaling, which is the practice of hunting whales, provided many products that colonists used at the time. They would export whale meat and blubber, which is the fat from the whales, and they would also use that blubber to light oil lamps. Fishing and whaling led to the growth of the shipbuilding industry in New England as well. Now, New England had a vast amount of forests for timber, and building a single ship could employ up to 200 workers, so very important to the area. By the end of 1700, New England built about a third of the British ships that were sailing at the time. So now let's take a moment here and let's answer these two questions. First, what four economic activities were important in New England? Two, in what ways were the goods provided by the Atlantic Ocean essential to the livelihood, economy, and culture of New England colonists? So New England becomes the center of trade. The merchants traded with other colonies and directly with Europe, and they conducted trade through the triangular trade, which we've talked about before. The idea that ships from Europe would go to the west coast of Africa, where they would purchase slaves that would then be transported across the Atlantic to the colonies to work on plantations, and then the raw goods from the colonies would be sent to Europe, and Europe would make them into, products, and then the whole thing would start over again. Growth of trade also increased the demand for sailors, and shipbuilders and sailmakers made the ships, and there was an increased need for them. The suppliers stocked the ships with provisions or the supplies of food, water, and other items needed for a journey, and dock workers loaded and unloaded ships. And so you can see how a lot of people in New England are relying on the shipping and trading industry for jobs. Port cities also began to spring up outside of New England in New York City, Philadelphia, and Charleston. And so there was a need to build ships to be able to go to those ports as well. When New England began turning large profits, the English decided they needed to take their cut. And so they passed the Navigation Acts, which were a series of laws passed by the English Parliament to protect English shipping by restricting the transport of goods to and from English colonies. Goods brought to England or its colonies had to be carried on British ships or ships made in the colonies. Certain colonial products could only be sold to England, such as tobacco, sugar, cotton, dye. So things made here or grown here in the colonies could only be sold to England. They couldn't sell to Spain or France. England controlled and taxed all trade to and from the colonies, and all European goods had to go to England first before they could come to the colonies. So if you had France, who had sugar plantations in the Caribbean, they would have to ship them all the way to England before England would ship them back to the colonies. So that would cost a lot more money and discourage that kind of trading. Goods were taken to England where they were unloaded, inspected, and reloaded on English or colonial-made ships, and they shipped those things to colonial ports where England charged additional taxes, and they taxed all goods that were not going to be shipped to England. So if we were going to ship something directly to somewhere else, there'd be an additional tax. And this is when colonists really begin resenting taxes and these additional charges that are being placed upon them. So what they do is they begin smuggling, and smuggling is the importing and exporting of goods illegally. We sometimes call this on the black market. The colonists were proving hard to control for England. Go ahead and pause the video, take a minute, and answer this question. Why did Parliament pass the Navigation Acts? Enslaved African Americans accounted for 2 to 3% of New England's population. I had told you before, there were very few African Americans, and especially enslaved African Americans, in New England. And this wasn't due really to colonial opposition to slavery or anything like that. It again had to do with the geography and the economics of the region. The farms were small. They couldn't afford large farms in New England, like plantations like they do in the South. And the weather didn't support plantation farming, which was where the need for enslaved people was coming from. Many of the enslaved individuals worked as household servants, farmhands, artisans, and laborers. They lived in their masters' houses and worked alongside them. Many of them practiced trades such as carpentry, and sometimes they'd work along freed African Americans in the shipyards in New England as well. Some African Americans were born free, but most spent their lives, at least part of their lives, in enslavement. A lot of the colonies at this time had where, you were only enslaved until you were 21 and then you were free, or things like that. And so they may have been born into slavery, but eventually were able to work themselves into freedom. They achieved freedom by fulfilling work contracts. Some self-emancipated, which means running away. Others were freed by their masters for faithful service throughout their lives. And some enjoyed legal rights, but they were definitely not treated equally. So some religious groups were also treated unfairly in New England, and we've already kind of touched on this when we were talking about the Massachusetts Bay Colony and people leaving to foreign places like Connecticut and Rhode Island for freedom religion. Puritans really see other Protestants as a threat, so Lutherans, for example, and Quakers. So to protect themselves, only male members of the Puritan Church could vote or hold office. And they would punish citizens who did not share their beliefs. So, think about, of course, I can't think of Anne Hutchinson, who was publicly talking poorly about the church, and she was banned, exiled, right? They end up hanging several Quaker missionaries, and they objected to the growing merchant class and the commercial values that were coming from it. So beginning in 1650, membership in the Puritan Church began to decline because people were unhappy. King Charles II sent a letter forbidding the execution of Quakers. Quakers and Baptists began to flourish in New England. The Puritans were pretty much given two options by King Charles II. Obey the terms of the colonial charter of Massachusetts Bay, or have that charter revoked. The charter guaranteed religious freedom, which is not what the Puritans were allowing. And remember, religious freedom is the right to practice the religions of one's choosing without government interference. However, Puritan leaders believed themselves to be higher than the authority of the king. And in 1684, King Charles II cancels the charter for Massachusetts Bay. James II succeeds Charles II, and he tries to take more control of the colonies. They're getting a little unruly. So what he does is he combined Massachusetts with other colonies to form the Dominion of New England. And this included Massachusetts Bay, Plymouth, New Hampshire, Maine, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New York, and New Jersey. And this is extremely unpopular among the colonists. They felt that they were stripped of their rights and their freedoms. So in 1691, Massachusetts is given a new charter. It guaranteed religious freedom for all Protestants, gave the right to vote to any man owning property regardless of their religion, and it led to a large increase in number of voters in New England. Puritanism continued to decline, but education was on the rise. So go ahead and pause, take a minute, and answer these two questions. Why was the percentage of enslaved African Americans low in New England? What impact did the 1691 Massachusetts Charter have on Puritanism? So as I mentioned, as the church is losing power, education is actually increasing in New England. They believed people needed to be able to read so they could learn about God. So they set up schools that focused specifically on the Bible and religious study, as well as teaching moral behavior so they could be active members in their communities. In the 1640s, Massachusetts legislature established what they called common schools, which were elementary schools essentially. And they created secondary schools, or what we call high schools, and they called those Latin grammar schools. Other states followed suit, and more people in New England could read than any other colony. Early education focused on teaching skills to help people thrive in the community. Many boys became apprentices, or people who learned a craft or trade by working with skilled members of that craft or trade. But the girls often did not receive an education and stayed with their mothers to learn skills necessary to manage the household and be a good mother and wife. Communities began to establish colleges, but of course the colleges only admitted men. Harvard was the first college established in 1636 by Puritans. William and Mary College in Virginia was established in 1693, and Yale College was established in 1701. The increased literacy rates created a demand for newspapers and books. In 1704, newspapers were popping up all over the country in a number of cities. Most of them focused on European events and politics, which helped the colonists feel less separated from England and closer. But readers especially enjoyed articles about the American experience, which means what was actually going on in the colonies. And maybe one of the most famous printers at the time is Benjamin Franklin, who published the Poor Richard's Almanac. In these almanacs, there were calendars and information about the weather and planting, medical advice, and even witty proverbs. Things like, fish and visitors stink after 3 days. Oop. Go ahead and pause the video and answer these 3 questions. What types of school did colonial New Englanders establish? What role did religion play in the importance of education in New England? And why would a newspaper's emphasis on European events and politics be helpful to colonial merchants?